Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 165, The True Adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
And welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And you have the true adventures of Burt and Scott here with you once again today. Truly. Right?
We do, and the problem that I have with it is the annotations. There's always somebody scribbling something down around my ankles.
You can never be too careful, so watch out down there.
Cut that out. Cut that out.
Cut that out! Just a little bit of administrative housework. The show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/ihose165, which is on ihearofsherlock.com. That is where you can leave us a comment in the show notes, or you can email us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we are I Hear of Sherlock in every one of those places. And, of course, we always welcome your thoughtful and erudite voicemails at 774-221-READ. We look forward to welcoming you there. Well, as this show goes live on March 30th, 2019, I am actually in Dayton, Ohio, at the Holmes, Watson, and Doyle conference that Dan Andriacco and team are putting on. So, hello from Ohio. Do I sound different?
You do. You sound more Midwestern. Be very interested in your report from that conference.
Yeah. Well, this is one of those wonderfully well thought out and highly curated conferences. It's a one-day thing, with a quick overnight. They welcome everyone in the night before, but it is the entirety of the conference is held in one day, and has a great lineup of speakers. So I will let you know how things turn out here.
Yeah, bring back audio.
Yeah. We are pleased to welcome Terence Faherty to the program. Terence is a technical writer turned novelist, and he's the author of the novel The Quiet Woman, the Seamus-winning Scott Elliott series about a 1940s actor turned war hero turned private eye, and the Edgar-nominated Owen Keene series, a failed seminarian who turns himself into a private detective. And even more importantly, Terence is one of the foremost authorities on the films of Basil Rathbone. He's an investitured member of the Baker Street Irregulars, having received the investiture Sir Charles Baskerville in 2011. Terence, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Why don't we begin at the beginning, and you tell us about how you first came into contact with Sherlock Holmes.
Wow, I can't remember whether I discovered the stories first or the Basil Rathbone Universal series first, but it was when I was 8 or 9 years old. I think I started plowing through all the stories. and all the movies.
8 or 9, that's pretty young.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, and we got all the New York stations. So in those pre-cable days, I had access to a lot of old movies. And I can clearly remember them showing a week of the Basil Rathbone Holmes films, and I just fell in love with them.
Now, is there any particular one of the Rathbone films that that stands out to you as a child, or that particularly spoke to you?
Well, I really like the ones that people that may not be the favorites of the Sherlockian world. The first 3, which were the World War II oriented ones, Voice of Terror, Secret Weapon, and Sherlock Holmes in Washington. Basil had the crazy hair style in that, which I think was a tribute to Gillette, but it's just my theory that it was. But anyway, I like those. I like the tone of them. The first one especially, which had a different director than the rest of the series, had a real film noir look to it. And I liked Holmes going up against the Nazis. It was, if you're going to update him to the 40s, you should have a reason for updating him, and that seemed to me to be a really good reason.
Yeah, that's a favorite of mine too. And you're right when you describe it as film noir. And then you had Thomas Gomez and
right,
and the great shadows. Yeah, that the characteristic of that picture was really different than the ones that followed. It was more of an A picture than a B picture, I always thought. But what kind of a kid were you? Did you always know that you were going to be a writer? Were you always involved in reading and stories and libraries?
Yes, I was that kid. I wrote my first book in the 6th grade. It was a Hardy Boys ripoff, so I've been ripping off people ever since, I guess. And one of the big turning points in my life was when even though I wanted to be a writer, I didn't want to be a mystery writer. I wanted to be a writer of literary fiction all through college. And when I got out of college, I tried to write the great American novel, and I kept hitting a wall, 10 chapters into anything I tried to write. And it finally occurred to me that while I was expecting everybody else to read this heavy novel I was trying to write, that when I relaxed of an evening, I would always pick up a mystery story. So I decided to try my hand at writing a mystery, and that was the breakthrough with the mystery plot to give the novel structure. I could, get through to the end of the story, basically.
And what was your first? What was the breakthrough book for you?
Dead Stick, the first Owen Keene novel. And Keene, as you mentioned, is a failed seminarian. He never actually becomes a private eye. He always stays an amateur sleuth, but all his cases have a kind of a metaphysical edge to them, and that made him an interesting character to write about. And the thing I realized was that the mystery, if you wanted to write a serious novel and make it a mystery, it was possible to do it. I believe it's possible to do it. And the Keene character, because of the kind of cases he was drawn to, let me explore that idea. It's incidentally one of the ways you can get writers to argue, like asking them whether they outline or not. But famous mystery writers like Dorothy Sayers maintain that the mystery could never be a serious novel. It was too preoccupied with the puzzle plot. And a contemporary of hers, Raymond Chandler, and I love both Chandler and Sayers. Chandler maintained that the mystery could be a serious novel, that the only limitations it had were the ones that the author brought to it. So I enjoyed encountering that debate as I read about the mystery.
Well, that's interesting. So what do you feel about, it sounds like the mystery structure, the puzzle structure was a godsend for you because it gave you the path to construct the story, but it doesn't sound like, you feel that the genre of mystery has any less worth than a great literary novel? What's an example of a great literary novel in your mind?
That is also a mystery?
No. I mean, just in general.
Oh,
I mean, if you could write like anybody, would you be sort of James Joyceing along, or are there contemporary writers you read?
No, I'd be Hemingway, I guess, if I could make the weight, which I've never been able to do. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Joyce.
All those people ended poorly, Terence. I think you're in better shape.
Well, mystery writers end poorly too. You might as well. It's not a happy ending profession necessarily.
So, did you, from the standpoint of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, and we're going to talk about your book, which is this wonderful new window and world into the cases of Sherlock Holmes. But did you take anything away from Conan Doyle because Conan Doyle rightly considered himself to be, and he was a master of structure. I mean, in his words, he knew how to do it, and he could do it again and again and again and again and again. Did you find lessons in the cases of Sherlock Holmes?
Sure, I think any mystery writer can use Doyle or Sir Arthur as his starting point. Years ago, I was reading an aviation writer on the subject of the Wright brothers, and he used a line that really impressed me. He said, the Wright brothers used up 90% of the magic, by which he meant that they had discovered and explored 90% of the basic aerodynamic laws that all aeronautical engineers would later use, and everybody else was kind of working in the 10% they hadn't gotten to. And I thought at the time that really applied to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, too, that he used up 90% of the magic in terms of the things he did in his stories, and that the rest of us, if we've been adding to that, we've been working in the 10%. Just recently it occurred to me that the kind of title I love, the Raymond Chandler type of title, the 3-word, simple, one adjective, one noun type, the big sleep, the high window, the little sister, which I associate with Chandler, was actually a Conan Doyle title preference. He just has so many. The yellow face, the cardboard box, the 3 Garridibs, on and on and on. So he even anticipated that kind of hard-boiled style of title. And he was one of the great storytellers of what was probably the great period of the short story, the late 19th, early 20th century, before other forms came along to compete with a certain kind of story. And the short story went off maybe in a more literary direction that kind of deprived it of a big readership.
Your bibliography includes both short stories and novels. Have you found any preference as a writer, or anything that comes easier to you on one side versus the other?
Well, I think I love being a novelist. There's nothing like introducing yourself to a stranger by saying you're a novelist. It's so much more impressive than saying you're a writer. But I think one of my failings as a writer is if you give me 70 or 80,000 words to work with, I will fill it up with plot. And so some of my mystery novels have gotten pretty convoluted plot-wise. If you restrain me to 10,000 words or less, then I think I'm a little bit of a better mystery writer at that length. And I find as I get older that I'm drawn more and more to the short story. It's appealing to have a project that you know from beginning to end you can wrap up in a couple of weeks versus one that's going to take you 8 or 9 months to finish.
Now I have to ask you this because you alluded to it earlier, so it's a bit of an unfair question. But Terence, do you outline?
Yes, I do. Even my short stories, I don't go into as much detail, but I want to know that that I have a story to write before I start writing it. The writers who don't outline, whom I admire, just seem to me to be taking a terrible risk that they're going to write and write and write and then not end up with a story. And what I've observed, or from listening to writers talk about their work, is that people who don't outline tend to, with rare exceptions, write the book twice. They write a kind of an amorphous first draft that they then retool. And I didn't want to have that extra step to that degree anyway. So I write, for my books, for a 70,000-word book, I'd write maybe a 7,000-word plot summary, which I call an outline. And so I'd know all the major characters, all the major scenes, who did it, all the clues, where they should be placed in the book, which is one of the things you have to work out. And so, some of the objections to outlining that I've heard from other writers, like it stifles your creativity and this, that, and the other thing, just haven't really resonated for me. I think of myself, when I'm outlining, being creative on a macro level, and then when I'm writing the book, the story, being creative on the micro level, where I'm having to actually cast the parts that I've come up with in the outline and come up with the settings and all that other stuff. So it still seems to me there's plenty of work to do. And the other objection that I've heard, well, I'll lose interest in the story if I know how it ends, always seemed to me a little bit odd too. I guess maybe because I'm Irish, and to an Irish person, having a story that you've told 100 times is a wonderful thing. I mean, you know where all the gags are and all the laughs should be, whatever. So, I have no objection to telling the story once I know the ending.
Yeah, I suppose it ultimately comes down to, personal preference and style, and if you feel comfortable with outline, then you should go with it. And I love the the analogy of the Irish storyteller. I mean that allows you to embellish it as you see fit, or to pull back in certain areas. So it really becomes a really important tool in a writer's toolbox if it's important to them.
Yes. No, I agree completely. Yeah. And it is very closely related to how you work as a writer. I'm a writer like Sue Grafton and Peter Lovesey, who likes to write every day at the same time, likes to write to a word count every day, likes to have a routine. And other writers aren't that way. They like to let an idea percolate and then, sit down for 3 weeks of 19-hour days and write the book.
Are you a morning writer? Is it the first thing you do when you get up is you pick up half a sentence? And
Right. Yeah, I'm always at my desk before 7 o'clock.
Yeah. Wow. And how many words do you try to put out in a day?
Well, in my heyday, when I was writing a book a year, I would try for 1,000 words a day, which I didn't always make, but I like to fail high. If I didn't get 1,000, I'd like to at least get 700.
Yeah.
And, I picked, a lot of writers do pages. They want to write 3 pages a day or something, which might be a better system. But I read somewhere where Louis L'Amour, the great Western writer, wrote 400 words a day, which is not all that many. But he wrote like 400 books. So the point is just doing it every day and keeping it up. And I suspect he was more polished. His 400 words were ready to go into the typesetter, and my 1,000 are not. But since I'm now closer to retirement and I'm mostly writing short stories, I still hit 1,000 words every once in a while.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself stopping writing? Do you see yourself really retiring from writing?
No, but the reality for a lot of midlist writers like me is that the opportunities to publish are drying up or have dried up. So I'd still like to be writing books, but I can't sell them. And I can still sell short stories. So as long as that continues, I think I'll continue to write.
Sure.
But, when you do get to be retirement age, so much other stuff intrudes. If you're married and your spouse is retired, then every day features other things that you're doing. So in some respects, short story writing is better suited to that kind of broken up writing time than novel writing was anyway.
Well, let's talk about the short stories you've got in the collection known as The Adventures of, The True Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And for our listeners, you of course know the 56 short stories that are put together. Of course, the first 13 appeared in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and appeared in the Strand magazine. But here's the catch. For over 100 years, we assumed that this was the true and unadulterated record of Sherlock Holmes and all of his triumphs and adventures. However, we find that in 2010 there was a collection of notebooks discovered that contained earlier drafts of these same stories written in Watson's own hand. And these newly discovered stories supposedly offer some of the true facts behind 11 of the cases. And that's where we pick up with the concept of the true adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So it's a great lot of fun, and we'll give you all of the ordering information at the end of the interview, and in a link in the show notes. But Terence, what inspired you to create a version of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes along these lines?
Well, back around 2010, I was looking for a new short story series to start, and I had just wrapped one up with Ellery Queen, and I didn't want to lose my space in their rotation. And I decided to try something Sherlockian. I think I was inspired by one of my early visits to a BSI dinner in New York. And I remembered an idea I'd had a few years ago about the possibility of rewriting The Scandal in Bohemia based on the alternate meaning of the word Bohemia. It can be a reference to this vague area of Middle Europe, but it could also refer to a avant-garde artistic community. So I thought, well, what if that's what it actually meant? You could reimagine the entire story. Then the King of Bohemia would actually be maybe the leader of this avant-garde artistic group, and instead of being blackmailed by a singer, he's being blackmailed by one of his models, a former prostitute. So that suggested a story that was different in tone than the original and kind of down market and potentially funny. And it also suggested that maybe I could reimagine Holmes as somebody who was a little more of a blue-collar detective, always interested in his fees, not a person that used cocaine, a guy who liked his beer at the end of the day, and who didn't play the violin, he played the banjo. And so that's how the first story came about. And then, of course, the challenge became, can I do that again and again and again?
It's April 1st, that jolly day in the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, when we practice hunting the gowk, and when our village elders travel to the Tower of London to view the annual ceremony of washing the white lions. But you don't need a special pass to enter by the White Gate. You have all the entertainment you can stand in Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the Newspapers, Volume 4, with a wealth of Sherlockian treasures from newspapers published in the first 6 months of 1894, when journalists remembered Sherlock Holmes after the Reichenbach, and Conan Doyle promoted transatlantic friendship. Chilled is the air with fallen rain. Flood deep the river flows. A sullen gloom haunts heart and brain, and no light shows. Spring arrives sooner. Once you reach for the pleasure only a book from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
You know, humor is probably one of the more difficult types of writing and performing in particular. Were there any examples that you kind of turned to say, well, this is the type of story I'm going for, the type of model I'd like people to think of?
Well, yes, it was really the work of P.G. Wodehouse. I'm a huge fan of his work. And so I wanted to write that kind of a story that was, on some level, fairly silly, and sometimes told with fairly pretentious language or fairly formal language, but was at its heart very silly, and was populated with silly characters. And the stories in the series, like The Engineer's Thumb, where I feel like I maybe caught a little bit of the Wodehouse taste, are the ones that are my favorites. Yeah,
well, Bert and I are both Wodehousians and, big fans of the work there. We had on Curtis Armstrong and Ashley Polisek and Elliot Milstein on episode 143 to talk about plumb lines. Or I'm not sure if that was the name of the book now, I'm blanking. But it was basically a biography of P.G. Wodehouse and the intersection between Wodehouse and Sherlock Holmes. So have you participated in the Junior Bloodstains at all during the BSI weekend when the Wodehousians and the Sherlockians kind of come together as one?
No, that's actually the first time I've heard of that.
Oh, well, we need to introduce you to this group. They have of course, the Wodehousians meet every 2 years for one of the big celebrations, and the BSI weekend happens every year. And what happens is they have a senior bloodstain at the Wodehouse convention, and then they have a junior bloodstain at the BSI weekend, and it's, Wodehousian Sherlockians and Sherlockian Wodehousians. And it's usually some kind of crossover. A play is performed, or I think there were even some puppets at one time or another, if I'm not mistaken. Right, Bert?
Oh, yeah. No, it's a lot of fun. I mean, there have been George Vandenberg had been bringing puppets. There have been plays. But this crossover interest between, of course, Wodehouse was contemporary to Doyle obviously before Doyle died in 1930, and had interviewed him and had played cricket with him on Doyle's cricket team. He was part of that group, and it's a big common interest. In addition to the conversation we had with Curtis, Ken Ludwig, the playwright who did Baskerville and his first play about Gillette and other things, is also a Wodehouse fan, and wrote a great skit for one of the senior Bloods. I don't know if it was a senior Bloodstain, but it was for the Wodehouse convention a couple of years ago. So this is a big common interest. But Wodehouse also, was a great structuralist. Terence, have you read any of Wodehouse's memoirs and so on? Because he was his life was taken up so much with plot and structure. And that really animated a lot of his letters, many of which existed to his friends Bill Townend and other people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, wouldn't he actually pin manuscript pages up on the wall around his study so he could visualize the pacing and the structure of the story that he was writing? I believe that's true. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald did something similar to that, too.
Yeah. Well, but the lovely thing about the humor in the Wodehouse stories is the characters just come to life on the page. And what you said earlier, I think, is really interesting, because you said, let's imagine Holmes as sort of a different character. He likes his beer. He's interested in money. And so one of the many nice things about the true adventures of Sherlock Holmes is the new voice you've given Sherlock Holmes. And one of the things that struck me was the opening of your 11th story in here, The Copper Beeches. And, we frequently encounter Holmes making comments in the cases Watson left us, like, the criminal world of, London is lost its ingenuity, and my mind rebels at stagnation. I have no problems to work on. But here's the opening of The Copper Beeches. To the man trying to make his pile as a detective, remarked Sherlock Holmes, carelessly tossing aside the daily tattletale. It's often the least important problems that bring home the biggest boodles. You've grasped that point admirably, Watson, to judge by the cases you've selected for immortality. Almost all your little records have ended with a golden payday, and perusing your manuscripts is almost as satisfying as thumbing my bank book.
Good reading.
Well, good writing. Yeah, and so you have made him in that same focused way, a very distinctive character, just as Bertie Wooster is focused, except when Bertie prattles on in the Wodehouse stories, he's usually much more inane.
True. Yeah. I have, not to give anything away, but in the second collection, the memoirs, if I finish it, the Musgrave Ritual becomes a Bertie Wooster story.
Oh.
So I had a great deal of fun writing that.
I'll bet. Now, one thing that's worth noting here is that this is the annotated edition that we have from Wessex Press here, and you gave three nods in the introduction to annotators and annotations. You want to enumerate those for us?
Well, one was Les Klinger, author of the great annotated Sherlock Holmes that I have open on my desk whenever I write one of these stories. And the other was George MacDonald Fraser, the Scottish writer who wrote the Flashman books. If you're familiar with those, they are purported to be the rediscovered papers of this Sir Harry Flashman, I think his name was, who was this famous Victorian general who turns out in his papers to have been a famous coward and bounder, but who managed to protect his secret throughout his life. And so the books are very funny. But then Fraser annotates them as though they're actual history. And his annotations, his notes, were always part of the favorite part of the book, almost the favorite part for me.
Yeah.
But he gets to do what a writer almost never gets to do, which is show off all the research that he did to write the book. So I decided when I wrote these that I would do the same thing, even though I'm not sure from a humorous point of view if it doesn't ruin the timing of the stories to have footnotes down at the bottom that draw people's eye away from the next joke. But anyway, I decided to do it. Oh, and the third nod of my head is to Wikipedia, which I call surely the greatest aid to serious research since the burning of the Royal Library of Alexandria, I think, something like that. But I love Wikipedia. It's I could spend hours going from story to story.
Yeah, definitely a rabbit hole. Well, how about we get you to read an excerpt from one of the stories? You've mentioned the engineer's thumb here, and I think that's an admirable example. Is there a particular excerpt from that story that you'd like to share, or how would you like to pick it up?
Well, let me try this dialogue between the engineer himself and his client. The engineer's name is Hatcher in my version. And his client is Colonel Strake, I believe. Anyway, Strake is trying to determine his Hatcher's level of discretion, and they get crossways discussing it in a way that I hoped was a little bit like E.G. Wodehouse. But anyway, it begins like this. Yesterday was especially quiet. In fact, I was thinking of leaving early when my clerk announced a visitor, one Colonel Lester Strake. He turned out to be a man built along the lines of a breadstick, his extreme thinness extending even to his face, which was all angles and protruding bones. As soon as my man had left us, Strake began questioning me in a way that made me feel I was back at my university undergoing an oral examination. "Mr. Hatcher," he said in a German accent, "I have been told that you are a young man of considerable competence and discretion. Is that so?" I replied that my diplomas and certificates were on display all about him. "Just so, but are you discreet? Let me speak more plainly. Can you keep a secret?" "If I promise to keep a secret," I replied, "you can consider it locked in the vault." "Are you making such a promise now?" "No, I'm simply describing it." The colonel pulled on his face somewhat inexplicably. "Will you make such a promise now, if you like?" "Now have you made it?" "No, I've merely stated my readiness to do so." He began to finger a heavy glass paperweight on my desk in a marked manner. "Please promise me that you will keep secret what I am about to divulge." "Righto," I said, smiling to myself at the long way this foreigner had taken around the barn. Anyway, sorry for the lack of German accent.
No, that's great. That was exactly the excerpt that I was going to pick, so I'm glad you did too.
Good.
That I occasionally vex my counterparts when they say, "Can I ask you a question?" And I say, "You just did." And it takes them a few tries to get through it. So a little bit of Wodehousian patter there.
Yes, the engineer is so obtuse that that's what makes the whole story work, in fact.
Exactly. Well, I think you've nailed another one of the universal human truths, and that is many times engineers, while noted for their technical capabilities, are not necessarily as attuned to societal subtleties, shall we say.
True.
Now, have you ever read the works of Robert L. Fish?
No.
The memoirs of Sherlock Holmes?
No, I have not.
I wouldn't quite put those on the level of Wodehousian humor. They're almost slapstick in nature. He has Sherlock Holmes and the Bagel Street mysteries, I believe it's what they were. And I think he did his writing back in the 70s and 80s. And again, the humor is hard, and we haven't seen a lot of examples of Sherlockian humor out there. So, I think between you and Robert L. Fish, there are very few in between.
Yeah, Bob Fish was a great member of the Cornish Horrors, but he had a completely different approach than the one that Terence has taken. He just sort of created this alternate universe, and it's much more slapstick comedy. But for folks who haven't read them, they really are a hoot. And Fish also was a Wodehouse fan, and in one of his stories, I think it was a Sherlock Holmes story, but maybe not. But in any case, he encounters it's built around Blandings, and of course, Blandings is the part of the P.G. Wodehouse universe in which there's a doughty lord who's very fixed on his prize-winning pig. And without giving the story away, I would say that the prize-winning pig in Bob Fish's story falls into the hands of the gypsies and has a unfortunate end.
Well, I'm not a specialist on Holmes parodies, but I remember when I was younger encountering a couple that another of my favorite writers of that period, O. Henry, had written. And I really dug into those expecting that they would be really good. And I was disappointed because, and I've seen this in some of the other early Holmes parodies, that they tend to be, as you say, burlesques, where they give Holmes a funny name. I think O. Henry called him Shamrock Jones or something. But and then they're just very broad humor after that, without a whole lot of. This isn't true of Mr. Fish's stories, I'm sure, but O. Henry's, not a whole lot of insight into Holmes' character or anything else about the actual stories. So when I started these, one of my goals was to try to write these humorous stories that were funnier the more you knew about Holmes, rather than what I saw that's a problem with O. Henry's, which was that the more you knew about Holmes, the less funny you would find this kind of a broad burlesque. So that's been my intention to, and I may have cut myself off from a broader readership by kind of focusing on the BSI type reader who's been over these stories so many times that he or she will get all the inside jokes.
Well, I don't think so. You know, one of the things we should mention about the book, too, is that one of the really nice things about the True Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the annotated edition, is that the layout, the typography, and the illustrations recreate the feeling of reading the stories in the Strand magazine. So you're reading these stories with illustrations from the Strand, and I won't give, not too much of a spoiler alert, but as an example, in The Man with the Twisted Lip, you use the terrific illustration of Holmes on his Eastern divan, sitting on the floor in the midst of his three-pipe problem, wrapped in a dressing gown, the great profile, staring intently, and the caption is, "You look just like a Maharaja, Mr. Holmes."
Yes.
So you have that whole other additional layer of humor, but I don't think you've, it's restricted at all to, people who are just BSI kinds of enthusiasts.
Good. Well, as you know, the book was published by Gassagine Books, which is Steve Doyle and Mark Gagan, both BSI. And Mark, I think, came up with the idea of try to make them look as the stories did when they originally appeared in the Strand magazine, and he did a wonderful job of that. As I go through and write them, I try to note which illustrations could also apply to my story, and sometimes I'm down to one. Usually I'm only down to one that could pass. But yes, I really love the look of the book.
And were the captions yours, or was that a team effort with the Wessex Press folks?
They're mine. They're actual lines from the story.
Excellent.
Which I think they did in the Strand,
They
too.
did, yeah. Well, it's a great lot of fun. The True Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, available at wessexpress.com. We will have a link to the actual page of the book, page of the website where you can purchase the book for $19.95. And you can also check out everything that Terence Faherty is working on at terencefaherty.com. We'll also have a link directly to his site as well. Terence, you mentioned the potential next volume here of the True Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. What else are you working on right now?
What else? I'm writing a short story series for Alfred Hitchcock, which is again humorous, and it's each story is, I call the series Margot and the Radio Detective, but Margot is an assistant radio producer in New York just in the final days before World War II, and she gets sucked into a hunt for Nazi spies in New York during the last days of the peace, which is being directed by this eccentric radio detective, a phenomena that you see in the movies. Bob Hope played a radio detective. Red Skelton did. These are guys that just got on the radio and talked about famous crimes or pretended to be criminologists, passed themselves off as criminologists. And this one in my stories, Philip St. Pierre just decides he's going to start rounding up Nazi spies. And so every story in this cycle is about that project. But they're meant to be like B movies on the page, like the Lone Wolf Spy Hunt or something that was being made at the same time.
Yeah.
Anyway, they've been fun to write.
Well, that sounds like it. Well, we will look forward to that, and I guess that's a mental note to have folks subscribe to the Alfred Hitchcock magazine.
Yes.
So, well, Terence, thank you very much for spending a little bit of time with us and telling us about the process behind your art.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, Bert. Appreciate it.
You know, the lovely thing about that conversation, of course, this is a particular interest of mine. I don't know how interesting it is to our listeners, unfortunately, is talking about, the structure and approach to writing and plotting. It's, I really enjoyed that. And the work, the planning, the organization, doing this successfully across these stories, the experience of looking at it as if it were in the Strand magazine is really a lot of fun. There are a lot of dimensions to this.
Yeah, there really are. And I have to say, just those flourishes, those light touches of the dialogue and the captioning and whatnot, there's really a fun sense to this book that in some cases you have to pay attention to. I mean, the reader who is familiar with the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the original stories, could easily gloss through these and say, yeah, I know this character, I know that character, I see what he's trying to get at. But it really does take a close reading. And Terence mentioned the annotations perhaps interrupting the flow of humor. Maybe, I think it adds to the uniqueness of the work, but it also creates the opportunity for the reader to go back again and experience this and pick up on some of those subtleties that they might have missed the first time around.
Well, I think you're right. And it does, here's an example. So this is the start of The Man with the Twisted Lip. This is the first paragraph. Asa Whitley, brother of the late Sir William Whitley of the Society for the Improvement of Drains, was a rake's rake. The pursuit of women, tall or fat, short or lean, was a habit that dated from his college days when, needing money for books, he'd undertaken part-time employment as a fitter of bustles during that fashion appliances 1881 vogue. And then there's a footnote, and the footnote says, the bustle was an article of women's underclothing popular in the second half of the 19th century. It could consist of soft padding or a rigid structure. In either case, it was worn on a woman's lower back for the purpose of supporting the heavy draped skirts of the period. The device's popularity ebbed and flowed, but it was nearing its apogee in 1881 when Asa Whitley made his ill-advised choice of part-time jobs.
And another thing that comes from if you read the thread through these 11 stories, and not in every single one of them, but in a few of them, not all is sunlight and happiness at the Watson household. He's typically in trouble with Mrs. Watson or trying to escape the vagaries of family life. So you can see why he would want to hang out with his former fellow bachelor Sherlock Holmes. So a lot of fun.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, the very next paragraph of The Man with the Twisted Lip, of course, Watson is telling this, says, one evening in the spring of 1889, there came a ringing at my front door bell. It didn't rouse me fully from a doze, but my wife and helpmate completed my transition to wakefulness by throwing her needlework at my head.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
The press is a very valuable institution if one knows how to use it.
Read all about it. Telegram! Westminster murder! Read all about it. Telegram! Read all about it. Westminster murder!
I must make something of it, although I've no doubt that every newspaper in London will be on the street with a full and detailed account.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
This is As We Go to Press with Mattias Boström. This time, the random date generator gives us September 27, 1936. I searched the newspaper archives and found an article from that day from the Atlanta Constitution with the headline, Miss Hayes to play Bambi renovated by Edith Meiser. I must confess, when I wrote my non-fiction book From Holmes to Sherlock, I had some special favorites from the Sherlockian history. I really love Edith Meiser. She seems to have been a fantastic person, and her importance for the continued success of Sherlock Holmes after Conan Doyle's death is enormous. She was the writer, producer, and director behind the popular American Sherlock Holmes radio series during the 1930s and 1940s. But let's go back to the article. As a young actress, Edith Meiser worked at the Theatre Guild, and that's where she met Helen Hayes, who later became one of the greatest actresses of the 20th century and received the nickname First Lady of American Theatre. The article is about a radio series that Edith Meiser wrote and in which her friend Helen Hayes acted. The article also let us know some things about Meiser's earlier career, for example, the Sherlock Holmes radio series. But what I find really interesting are some of the facts mentioned in the article, things that I had never heard about before. For example, when Edith Meiser had her own vaudeville act during the 1920s, she was actually used as a trial. I quote, "If the audiences liked her, high-priced people like Beatrice Lilly and Ruth Draper were booked in. If the audiences didn't go for the Meiser talent, Lilly and Draper were carefully sent someplace else." Meiser quit her vaudeville act, but started writing sketches for other vaudeville artists. And then she went on to radio. And I quote again, "Her first radio series was a bunch of dramatic skits designed to show people how to can meat and things like that." And soon after that, she started writing the Sherlock Holmes scripts. I love every little fact that makes a person like Edith Meiser come more and more alive, especially since she is no longer with us, and I desperately want to get to know her better. That's why I go to the archives and correspondence and autobiographies and old newspapers.
Well, that sound you hear there are the dulcet tones of our theme song for Canonical Couplets, everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. You will remember that the last time around we quizzed you with this. More than a yard, plus Pinkertons could handle, was solved by Sherlock with a lighted candle. Bert, do you know which story that referred to?
Oh, yes. That's the Valley of Four, isn't it?
Not even close, and certainly no cigar. No, this was the adventure of the Red Circle. Right? Pinkertons, of course, on the case in New York, and Holmes kind of spelling out the code there with the candle in the window. But you were not alone in your supposition that it was the Valley of Fear. We had a number of entries that went along those lines as well. However, we will spin the big prize wheel and see who comes up here. And it looks like it is number 11. And that corresponds to Tom Huntington. Tom, congratulations. You are a repeat winner here, so well done, Tom. We will be in touch with next steps for you. And in the meantime, we will get on with our Canonical Couplets quiz for this episode. We learn, amid romantic revelations, what Holmes would think of the United Nations. If you think you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email with the email subject line Canonical Couplets, addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com. If you're among the correct answers, we will select you, and hopefully you'll win a prize. Good luck. Magoo, you've done it again. I don't know how we keep doing this.
Well, it's persistence. You know, it's like Terence Faherty says, we just get up and make our outlines and off we go.
Yeah.
Repetition.
But we're not recording 1,000 words a day, though. That's the difference.
Hey, now there's a podcast I wouldn't want to listen to.
Yeah, neither would I. But in the meantime, we invite you to listen to this every opportunity you get, as well as our companion show Trifles over on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. And until the next time we meet and greet at your very feet, this is Scott Monty.
And this is Bert Wolder looking up.
And together we say, the caves afoot.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
All right. That was the FedEx truck going by.
Oh, dear.
Everything.